Welcome everyone to the South Shore or South of Boston webinar. I'm Rick Kaplan, the host of the webinars. I want to thank everyone for attending today. Unfortunately, it's pouring out and, you know, I'm sure some people might have got stuck in traffic, but it's a webinar, so no one has to worry about that. I want to thank our partner with the South of Boston event. We do this every year. I want to thank the South Shore Chamber of Commerce. They're fantastic people to work with, and it's a great organization for anyone that might be interested in joining a chamber. They do an awful lot for the South Shore. I also want to thank all of our sponsors for today. Our platinum sponsors, Ellis Realty Advisors, A.W. Perry, Atlantic Mechanical Contractors. Our gold sponsors, Accelerator Construction Corporation, Rockland Trust Bank, Jack Conway Realtors, Green International Affiliates, Inc., Axiom Architects, Norwell Services Company. Our corporate sponsors, Inspired Technology, U.S. Pavement, Cape Cod 5, First Citizens, Platinum Partners LLC, and Northmark. And that is our panel for this morning. I want to thank them all for speaking with us. We should learn quite a bit this morning. And then please do join us for our week 2. We'll have another panel discussion, and that is development hotspots, untapped development, and development in the pipeline, which is something we all like to hear about. And then week 3, another great panel discussion. This will be on post-pandemic retail. And retail, everyone has some curiosity what's going on with retail, and this would be a great webinar for people to attend. Lots of great information will be put out there. Moving on. Well, we're moving a little fast here. South Shore 2030. If anyone's interested in finding out more information, please contact them at the South Shore Chamber of Commerce. They have a lot of great webinars, a lot of great information that they serve for the people from the real estate industry, or for the commercial and regular residential real estate. So please do contact them. A little more information on South Shore Chamber and what they do. And again, thank you to all of our sponsors for today, and also I want to thank all of our speakers as well as our attendees. Thank you all for joining us this morning. And now I'd like to share a video of one of our platinum sponsors, Ellis Realty Advisors. And that was Ellis Realty Advisors, which that video tells a lot about what's going on the South Shore. And right now we're going to begin our panel, and I want to introduce the moderator for our first panel of this series, and it is Peter Forman. He's the president and CEO of the South Shore Chamber of Commerce. And I hand it over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Rick. And thanks to you, John Picard, New England Real Estate Journal, for, again, partnering with us for the South of Boston Summit. We really have looked forward to this each year because it gives us a chance to actually talk to so many leaders in the market and get a good sense of what's happening. Rick, you rhetorically said on the retail panel coming up that everyone is curious about what's going on with retail. I think these days everybody's curious about what is going on, period, and how does this shake out. And this gives us a good chance to really get the first formal program we've had with a large number of people to start thinking about what reopening looks like. For those who aren't familiar with the South Shore Chamber of Commerce, we are the largest business association on the South Shore, a regional chamber covering generally the Route 3 corridor from Plymouth up to Quincy, down the southern 128 tip to Randolph, and overall about 25 communities we think make up an economic catchment area. A few years ago, we took on a fairly ambitious project of setting out a comprehensive economic strategy for the area, knowing that just 5 years ago, we expected there were a lot of changes occurring in this market. We wanted to know how the South Shore could be more competitive and what our economy looked like. We set out that plan called South Shore 2030, and people can find more information on it at southshore2030.com. We've been involved with several projects trying to change the underlying economy and our competitiveness, starting with housing as an economic strategy, now looking at transportation and infrastructure issues such as water, wastewater, placemaking. How do we assist municipalities? This morning's session helps kick off the entire series, where we'll have a chance to look at where we think the South Shore is coming out of the pandemic, what recovery might look like, what reopening looks like from a development perspective. We have 4 great panelists who are joining us this morning to offer some perspective and then answer questions. Carol Bulman is president and CEO of Jack Conway and Company. It's the largest independent real estate firm in Massachusetts. Jack Conway, if you're not familiar, was founded by Carol's father, Jack Conway, back in 1956, and it is now the largest real estate firm in Massachusetts, with 700 agents brokering residential and commercial real estate and providing all of the services from insurance to staging to moving to property management services. It's based in the South Shore. I can say for a short while that it's headquartered in Norwell. It will soon be re-headquartered in Hanover. Talk about a year of change. The main headquarters, I know, burnt down about 2 years ago, and Carol is rebuilding it on the original site and moving the headquarters back to where Jack started the company back then in Hanover, and maybe she'll tell us a little bit more about that. And it stretches from the North Shore to Cape Cod. Nancy Bailey is the first vice president and lending center manager in the Braintree office of Rockland Trust. Rockland Trust has been a leader in our 2030 effort and a key funder of our housing initiative that is now in its 3rd year. Nancy's been with Rockland Trust for 19 years, but has over 30 years total experience in banking, spanning a couple of economic highs and lows. Nancy, you can help compare this pandemic setback to all of the other recessions we've had over the last 20 years. She specializes primarily in real estate lending for investment, development, and for sale products. Judi Barrett is the principal of Barrett Planning Group, LLC, a planning and development consulting firm that works with cities and towns throughout New England. Judi has played on both sides of the equation when it comes to municipal development. She has been a municipal official for many years and a consultant, I think in some way for maybe half of the towns, or you've consulted with projects in perhaps half the towns in Massachusetts. And that's not an exaggeration. You can tell us the number, but an incredible amount of experience and somebody we turn to a lot when it comes to how we work with municipalities for economic development. And finally, Win Sargent is CEO of Massachusetts Transportation Company, which owns P&B Bus Lines, Brush Hill Transportation, McGinn Bus Company. And he is also the vice chair of the South Shore Economic Development Corporation, which is a subsidiary corporation of the South Shore Chamber and is driving our 2030 plan. Carol, I'm going to kick this off with you. In 2020, Conway and Company had a record sales volume of $1.1 billion and sold more than 2,300 homes. I'd like you to talk a little bit about both of those points, because I think a lot of people thought housing prices went up. So I'd like to know your view with those numbers. What was happening to the real estate market, both with product that was coming on, demand, what was happening with prices, and look at the residential market first during the slowdown and what you're forecasting for recovery.
Thanks, Peter. It's good to be here. Thank you to New England Real Estate Journal and to all my fellow panelists. Wish I could see all of you out there. Someday soon we'll all be able to be together, but this will do for now, and it's great to have this opportunity. So a lot has happened, Peter. You know, as we all know, a year ago now, our world's completely changed, and for a while they came to a stop where we all needed to figure out, would our businesses continue? Would we be able to put food on the table? What exactly was going on with the pandemic? How could we keep ourselves safe, our families safe? So we did a lot of that research and settling in for about 4 to 6 weeks. So this time we're now comparing this year at Jack Conway Company to a real slowdown. You know, that slowdown is about to come up. But of course, that's not what happened at all. We anticipated a huge slowdown as a result of the pandemic. Of course, behaviors changed drastically. And once people figured out what they could do, and that a large percentage of people, although many people did lose their jobs and were underemployed, there were many people that were employed out there, and savings were increasing, rates were staying low, people had time in their hands, behaviors were changing. And what has been incredible for me, I've been in the real estate mortgage business since 1983. And I've never seen anything that affected people's behavior so much and so drastically, very, very quickly. So what we experienced was this incredible movement as a result of change of behavior. So there's 4 things that really affect people's behavior when it comes to housing: their family situation, their occupational situation, their leisure activities. What do they like to do? And also their dreams. You know, do they like to travel? Do they want to do something different? So if you think about all those 4 areas, all 4 of those areas changed. So we saw a huge, huge change in that, Peter. And just quickly to say, as a result, prices ended up increasing by 15% for the entire year. We did a lot of ups and downs throughout the year. And our business was up 15%. Pretty much the same, mostly driven by average price. So we're very fortunate, very grateful for that. And it's been quite a wild ride.
The changes that were taking place in people's behavior, did it change fundamentally what people were looking for in product?
It did. It was interesting because, you know, if you think about what was happening, and I think as I go through some of these examples, you're going to think of people in your lives that fit each one. So first of all, there's this huge population group, which is the older millennials. so you've got your younger millennials and your older millennials. Well, the older millennials did a lot of behavior changes during the pandemic. And now the millennials, as most of us know in this call, have now surpassed the baby boomers in being the largest population group. So that older millennials really drove a lot of what I really call a buyer frenzy. There is a huge buyer frenzy out there right now, which is continuing to drive pricing up. So those older millennials, you know, I'm generalizing, but this is a lot of what we're seeing, you know, maybe moving out of the city to the suburbs. Family starts and marriages really pushed, was a big piece of buyer demand. And, you know, I think a lot of us can experience this. A lot of people got new puppies, you know, not only families, but animals. And so that means yards, that means space. And then that moves on to the telecommute piece. You know, these people like us, I mean, I still go back and forth between my home office where I am now and my office in Norwell. And we've learned that we can telecommute. And so that means people thought, geez, my kids are homeschooling. It's loud. We all had these big open floor plans. People were looking for more private space in homes, more yards, and then more access to leisure, meaning walking trails, water. You know, people like the beach. They want to be near the ocean. So there was a big push to kind of filling our souls, if you will, in this last year. And people reacted. They reacted very, very quickly. The other thing that was huge, and I'm sure a lot of you either experienced this yourselves or heard of people doing this, is vacation homes. So New Hampshire was big, Vermont was big, even people buying homes off the grid, you know, in Maine or Vermont and New Hampshire became a thing. And then of course, Florida and Cape Cod just completely exploded. So here you have many people that are employed. Some people are not, but the people that are employed can't go to restaurants. They're not going to the regular vacations. They're saving money. And so they're investing in something that makes them happy. And it's something they can do that they couldn't do before.
I'm going to ask you all this question as we look at the recovery after we go through each perspective individually. But one of the big discussions when people think about reopening is starting with a preliminary question of what was a disruptor and what was an accelerator? What changes were already taking place that simply accelerated during this, and what really changed the market? So Carol, let me ask you, when you mentioned the millennials now being the largest population group, with residential real estate, is the COVID slowdown an accelerator or a disruptor?
I would say accelerator, because I think family starts and a lot of those changes that millennials have taken, and maybe they sped up, not necessarily wasn't going to happen at all, but it was sped up. The other thing too is when we came into this time last year, we already had a shortage of inventory, meaning properties to sell. So we already had a huge a disconnect between supply and demand. So we already had that. And then this just accelerated things. The other piece is I mainly talked about the demand side. On the supply side is people like me. I'm on the younger side of the baby boomer generation, and we are staying in our homes longer. And so we're holding on to our houses. Plus people are thinking, geez, if I sell my house, where am I going to go? You know, so this could be a really good time to sell their house. And then the question is, now, where am I going to go? And that comes a lot back to our 2030 plan, Peter. And I'll leave you with this on that question, because I reflected a lot on the beginning of the creation of the 2030 plan. And the whole concept was to attract younger people to the South Shore with jobs and businesses and housing. Well, they're here. So businesses can come down because there is a lot of people willing and wanting to, you know, settle in and make their home and spend money here. So I think our 2030 plan has been really accelerated as well.
Is there a disruptor in the residential real estate? Is everybody doing away with their dining room and making it a home office now? Is that a permanent change?
So that's an interesting thing, because this whole thing has really been fascinating to me, because what was fascinating is how quickly behaviors changed. So I think a lot of people think that that's permanent. I actually think that behaviors will change back as well. You know, I mean, all of a sudden, this is going to be in our rearview mirror, and people can say, "Oh, I want that big open floor plan again. My kids are back at school again." You know, we forget and we go back. So I'm not sure if all of the floor plan issues are permanent, but I think maybe people have a different sense of what's important after COVID. So I think a lot of the life change is permanent.
Nancy Bailey, in all of the discussions that I participated in and listened to about forecasting what changes, the foggiest crystal balls out there are what is happening to office space in the commercial market. Will big companies make the telecommuting a permanent feature of how they do business and change their office space, sell off office space, slim down? What are you seeing in the commercial market? I'm going to ask you first to focus on the office market, and then we'll get into some of the other commercial sectors. But what are you seeing in the office market in the city and the suburbs?
Well, thank you, Peter. Well, to say that businesses had to change operations over the past year definitely had to happen. So many workers leaving and working at home. It put a strain on the businesses when it came to technology and making sure that everyone had the technologies that they needed to do their work remotely. But, you know, with the increasing availability of vaccinations, not everyone can get them yet, but I mean, I think there is a certain amount of excitement about that. We are seeing offices talking about coming back in person. I think there's probably going to be a hybrid of that for a period of time where, you know, a couple of days in the office, a couple of days out of the office. But we are hearing, you know, especially in the city, you know, that one's going to be a little bit more difficult. And I think nationwide, you're hearing different news reports about big vacancies going to happen. You know, Fidelity is going to get rid of space or this or that. But, you know, we are hearing that even the big companies are saying the employees missed out on the camaraderie and the networking with each other, and sharing ideas and, you know, using that bullpen type of thought process that, you know, has been successful. So I think, you know, office in the suburbs, I think, might be a little bit more quickly returning to a normal. I don't think that, you know, it's going to be a huge vacancy, you know, continuing anyway in Boston. You know, maybe people want more of the office space versus the big common shared workspace that had become popular. But overall, I think that, you know, they'll be going back to work at some point. I mean, I think it's going to be a little slower in town than it is on the South Shore.
Do you think larger companies in the cities are going to hedge their bets and think more about satellite spaces in the suburbs in case there are future events like this, and they learn something from that? Or is the big lesson from this going to be versatility in doing remote work and using technology to make up for office space if people aren't able to get together?
I think it might be a combination of both. I don't think there's going to be a mass exodus out of the city and, you know, everyone's going to be in the suburbs with their offices. There might be some of that when, you know, companies realize that they have to have in-person staff. But because remote working has become so successful, I think that a lot feel that they can stay in the city and do a hybrid model if ever needed again. I mean, God willing, we'll never be in the same position that we've been put in over this last 12 months. But, you know, I think time is going to tell. I don't think anyone really knows. Like you said, that crystal ball is very foggy right now. So, you know, we're doing our best to kind of gauge it. But I'm, you know, not seeing big shutdowns of companies or anything like that. So time's going to tell. Like being with your offices in the satellite already on the South Shore, I think it's a much easier place to be while bringing back your employees.
Given what you do with commercial real estate, you have that gives you a chance to really look into a lot of different sectors and what is happening with those. What are you seeing in the other sectors besides office space, in warehousing, in manufacturing, distribution? You've seen a change in activity in the South Shore in those areas?
I was just talking to a customer of mine yesterday who's in manufacturing, and he had the best year on record last year. He had to, follow the protocols of cleaning and social distancing. He runs a machine shop, and he said he had, again, the best year in his career. So I think it depends upon the industry. I know that if companies are dealing with having to have parts from overseas, that has impacted, their ability to create their own materials. I think I heard on the news just about how bicycles now have just become, the wait lists are huge, and a lot of the bicycles are coming to the shops with no pedals because they can't get that part. So they have to go somewhere else. So I think it does depend. The industrial market is pretty strong right now, because people learn, if you're at home and you're looking to shop, you want that distribution to be a lot quicker. I mean, Amazon has, come into the market very strong. And I think the industrial market has definitely become an investment that even just investors are looking to acquire. It's been kind of a hot commodity right now.
Acceleration or disruption? What are you seeing with some of the changes in commercial activity that you think might be somewhat permanent disruptor or an accelerator of change?
Well, disruptors, the COVID definitely hit so many so hard. And when it came to restaurants, when it came to people being able to pay their rent, which in essence is going to affect the landlord's ability to pay the mortgage. Those are things that, we have had to try and work out with our borrowers, people that might have a strip mall that has 3 restaurants in it, that, you have to deal with COVID forbearance and trying to help work them through that. Where everyone right after the shutdown was able to kind of take a breath and stay at home and kind of figure things out, we in banking were ramping up because of PPP. We worked some of the longest hours I think a banker's ever had to do, trying to get that PPP money out to borrowers to just help bridge that gap. So the disruption has been huge. I don't know how permanent it will be when it comes to long-term, but it has been quite a volatile disruption.
Carol, what are you seeing in the commercial real estate sector in the suburbs?
We're seeing similar, to what Nancy talked about. And again, a lot of what we're seeing is the movement in the smaller spaces. So people are still wondering what's going to happen as far as the future goes. But our experience on the commercial side was it was less emotional, which it generally is. It's less emotional. So it didn't react quite as quickly. I think there was more of a wait and see attitude among commercial real estate. And I feel like it's starting to pick up in the last 3 to 4 months. That's what we've seen is businesses are realizing now, okay, what does the future look like? I can now make some decisions. It was interesting because you had talked about our building that we're building in Hanover. And yesterday I was actually at a warehouse out in Leominster, Mass, looking at furniture. And they were asking me, how high do you want the barriers between the workstations? And they said, everyone's going for these high barriers. And I thought, well, I'm planning for post-COVID. Now, maybe I'm an optimist, but I'm thinking eventually, we might not be in these huge workplaces like Nancy said, but I think there is somewhere in between. So from a business owner's perspective, I think we look at more of the economic changes and how people will behave rather than, have to do something right now. So that's what we're seeing. There's still an inventory crunch, just like there is in residential on the commercial side. There's still more buyers than sellers. The leasing market is still very strong, but we're still seeing more people wanting to buy than lease.
Great. One of the positive changes I've seen, I think it was an accelerator, not a disruption, generally, is how government officials, particularly municipal officials, view small business, and a recognition of how important it is to help support small business and in many ways encourage development. Judi, as I mentioned up front, you've been on both sides of the equation as municipal planner for many years in several towns, and now a consultant in so many municipalities. What are you seeing during this from the municipal angle in terms of almost eagerness to help with commercial activity and some development?
So I'm going to answer your question, and I'm going to steal the show because I actually have some slides to put up. But, you know, there is an awareness, I think, when you're a small town and your town hall's in the center of the community and your employees were used to walking out the door and going to a nearby restaurant or coffee shop, and it's not there. I think it kind of hits home, both just in a very direct way, but also, you know, the impact on the commercial real estate in the community. I think a lot of times, at least in the communities I've worked in, people are very aware of the importance of a commercial tax base, but they don't necessarily make the distinction between the commercial tax base, the commercial property owner, and their business tenants, and how important it is to sustain those business tenants. And I think there's a sensitivity to that now that I didn't see before, or perhaps a heightened sensitivity to it, especially in those communities that had the wherewithal and the capacity to offer some small business assistance, which many of our communities did. So kind of a real connection with, you know, the coffee shop owner, the restaurant owner, the small manufacturing concern that maybe had 10 employees. And I think just a real awareness now that there are these little businesses in our communities that sometimes towns didn't even know existed. So that's been a very interesting, I think, educational experience. I you know, often do sort of economic base analyses for master plans for communities. And I would find, you know, little industries pocketed in communities that the local officials didn't even know about. There's a much greater awareness now as to what's tucked into some of our older industrial parks and, you know, who's in flex space around the corner. It's really fascinating. I think there's a much greater awareness now of what our employers are, in addition to where our commercial taxes are coming from. But if you don't mind, I actually kind of put some thought into this and kind of decided to kind of frame a picture of what's going on with municipalities in sort of 5 questions. So Courtney was kind enough to say she would run this. So for the record, I think it's 25 towns in our region, Peter. Is that what we have in our area?
That's generally what we consider an economic submarket of Boston in our.
Yeah. And that makes sense to me. I mean, I've worked in 15 of those communities in varying capacities. I don't know them all equally well, but I've been around on the South Shore, and I've actually seen some of these things from multiple perspectives. I am a consultant. I've been a consultant since 1996. However, I also worked for state government. I worked as a town staff person in community development, and I still serve on a town board in my community. So I have these different hats, and it's actually kind of fun to think about what's going on in our municipalities. So I think there are kind of 5 questions I wanted to sort of address in thinking about where we are. And the first one, which I think Peter you were alluding to, was how local governments looking at growth and change today, and is that different? Is it, in your terms, a disruptor or an accelerator? What are cities and towns bringing to the table in terms of trying to encourage or entice development or shape development in their communities, and where are they still stuck? You know, our communities on the South Shore have in many ways the same issues communities all over the state have in terms of this almost schizophrenic view of development. I want it, but I don't. How has the pandemic affected municipal operations, including planning, our relationships with businesses, development and permitting? And how are communities responding to the call for diversity, equity, and inclusion? I think this is a very important question because as the pandemic has been going on, there have been other things taking place nationally in parallel that are shaping some of the conversations going on in city and town halls. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is housing still the enemy? Because as some of you know, Carol, I know you're very on top of what's happening with the housing market, and I love to hear you talk. My experience as a planner is communities often see housing proposals and they want to run the other way because everybody's so concerned about growth. But I think some of that is changing. And so I want to talk about that a bit too. So Courtney, if you want to go to the next slide. So how are governments changing? I think there is a great awakening taking place. And if you don't know who that guy is, I'll let you all guess. Maybe I'll quiz you later. I think most towns today do recognize the value of new development and certainly reinvestment in existing built assets. I see this changing. I would say maybe even as recently as 10 years ago, a real kind of almost an adverse reaction to development that now today in some of our communities on the South Shore, there's a real conversation taking place about, can we kind of get mixed use development? Can we get more housing choices? Can we create better places, neighborhood activity centers, revitalizing downtowns? These are issues that I think all of our communities in one way or another are having to deal with. And so there's a change in the frame of reference about it. There's certainly a greater understanding about the capacity of development to bring tax revenue, and also, frankly, for development to contribute to the capital improvements that towns on their own cannot afford. That kind of conversation, I think, is more sophisticated today. There's certainly a greater understanding in the planning world around balancing conservation and development. As I said, when you start to see your local restaurants closing, and some of them come back and some of them don't, it just makes people think about what kind of environment are we offering our businesses so they can actually come back and thrive here. I see somewhat more courage to use zoning to incentivize development. I often tell my municipal clients, there are certain things you bring to the table to shape how your community is going to evolve. You have the capacity to raise revenue, certainly. You have the capacity to regulate, and to regulate in ways that are very constructive. You have the capacity to invest in infrastructure and utilities. And most centrally, you have the capacity to lead a conversation. So how can you bring all those things together to get the kind of development that you want in your community? I'm seeing more courage today than I used to see about how to use zoning to get to a yes instead of a no. And I see also somewhat more interest in expanding housing choices. I think there is more awareness of this. To some extent, frankly, I think it may be because it's sort of been forced on some communities, but I am seeing people start to get the idea that perhaps being able to expand housing choices does have an impact on the access for workers, and how people get to work, and how do you deal with lifestyle when people are spending an hour or more in commute. Perhaps it doesn't need to be that way. So I think there's a more sophisticated conversation happening about housing today, including affordable housing. Next slide, Courtney, if you would. So what are communities able to bring to the table? One thing I think is just getting better and better, and this is really even a longer term question, Peter, and not just pandemic, but to some extent, I think it's been accelerated. This professionalization in town management and what that means to a developer, an applicant for permits, having people you can actually talk to in a town hall who understand the permitting environment and what entitlements mean and so forth. I just think generally professionalization is improving. Frankly, I think in our COVID time, it's essential that communities have professional leadership, because the problems that are happening in our communities with, tenants, with small businesses, they're things that often volunteers like me, volunteer on a town board, we don't have time to deal with this stuff. And yet there are live problems happening in our towns. So having competent managers, competent community development professionals, this has been an ongoing change in communities, but I think I've seen an accelerated appreciation for it, especially when you have a town hall or a city hall suddenly shutting down and people still need services. And how do you get those? Credit to our municipalities for, even though they've shut down their city and town halls because they've had to, service delivery has continued. You know, what's working better today? I'm seeing an uptick in communities investing in their capital plan. We've gone through a period here where everything was kind of going into operations, and communities are having to face the fact that they've got school buildings falling apart. They have police stations that are, you know, woefully obsolete. And so investing in capital improvements is really a way of a community to say, we're proud of this place. We're going to be a modern operation here. And we want people to be proud of who we are. That's a positive message to send to the business community or to prospective developers, is that we're actually proud of this place and we're showing it by investing in our plant. Much greater sophistication and leveraging grants. Certainly in the last year, communities have become very conscious about how to get their hands on money to assist people in need, whether it was tenants facing eviction or businesses and whatever, and homeowners in some cases. Negotiating skills and know-how, this is improving, and it's improving in part because some communities are facing large development proposals. That has not gone away because of the pandemic. Learning how to sit at the table and talk to a developer and be able to meet the developer's needs and also get amenities, services, and investment in the community, I think is something that people are getting better at. A willingness to test controversial ideas. Communities, I think today, and this is, I don't want to be broad brushing out this isn't true of every town, but some communities are getting it about having conversations with their residents and their businesses about things that people may not have wanted to talk about before, especially in the realm of development. Around housing choice is probably the one that's the big lightning rod, but it's certainly not the only one. And then greater understanding of development risks and costs. If you push the developer too far at the negotiating table and they walk away, what have you gotten? Nothing. Next slide, Courtney. But there are things that, you know, are still stuck. And it's not just our towns on the South Shore. I think this is true everywhere. I don't work, only in Massachusetts. I work pretty much all over New England. And, to answer your question, Peter, I've actually worked in 179 towns in Massachusetts. And I have to tell you that what I see on the South Shore is really not any different from what I see anywhere else. There's still a lot of opposition to growth. I think it's better, but it's still out there in some communities. And my feeling is if you're a community that doesn't want growth, then you may or may not get it, but focus our efforts as planners, as policymakers on the communities that do want to invite change. I think it's still hard for communities sometimes to separate what NIMBY, which is not in my backyard, from kind of real issues that people may have about development happening in their backyard. I always try to tell my clients, you need to listen for what are real issues versus things that just people don't want change. Because if you don't, then you're really missing an opportunity perhaps to get a development to even be better for your community than it was when it came through the door as an application. Public participation, social media, I think this is a big challenge for a lot of communities. I don't know how many of you follow Facebook or whatever in your own towns, where every town seems to have a discussion group of some kind. But some of these things are pretty nasty. And I think it's hard for local governments because it's the unit of government that's the most in contact with people on a day-to-day basis, whether it's Zoom or coming to the counter. Local government sees people more than any other level of government. And so there's a heightened sensitivity, I think, to basically being bashed on the internet. This has been a challenge for a lot of towns. So some people kind of have it down. Others are saying, we're not going to have departmental Facebook pages. We're not doing any of that because we're just too much at risk. There is more professionalism. Some of it's inconsistent. We're a state where people still value home rule. And so in a lot of communities, even as we see the hiring of more professionals, we also see people in elected capacity still kind of wanting sometimes to control things in ways that they may not have the time or the expertise to do. The zoning adoption process, at least for housing, is going to get better now that the housing choice bill was passed. But it's still rocky and it's still kind of difficult. We made it that way. And our legislation doesn't make zoning adoption easy. And it's because we're trying to make sure we don't end up with a runaway train at some legislative process somewhere. But it's hard sometimes for communities to get through and end up with a bylaw or an ordinance going to our legislative body that bears any resemblance to what it started as. And there is still a struggle, I think, between planning, regulations, and policy. Many of our towns on the South Shore have recently done master plans or housing plans or economic development strategies. And they're sometimes hard to go from that plan, which is kind of 5,000 feet off the ground, into actual action. I think that remains a challenge for some communities. Others are doing really well and having conversations about mixed use development, having conversations about housing, regardless of what the state is saying. So, you know, I do see some communities are advancing down this path faster than others. And we should just be aware of that and support the ones that are. Courtney, next slide. People are yearning for the before time. I love this phrase, but you know, what have municipalities done? They've done a great job, I think, graduating to Zoom and learning how to serve the public in this remote format. Despite the closure of city and town halls, almost all of us could get hold of somebody, whether it was by email, being able to participate in meetings. This is one of the best things I've seen as a planner. People used to say that like the public meeting was the be all and end all. It isn't. We've seen people participating in planning meetings who never would have shown up at 7 o'clock at night for some, visioning session because they're home with their kids. Now they're on Zoom, and yeah, their kids may be in the background, but we're getting them to participate. And those are people we want. They're young people. We want them involved in our communities. And I think remote participation is making it possible for them to participate in ways they never did. There are equity issues, but I think on balance, at least in many communities, this is working well. I'm seeing an awareness now, a greater awareness of the potential for partnerships between public health staff and public safety. We have older people in our communities. I'm in that middle group of the baby boom. So, you know, I'm kind of seeing this even in my own neighborhood where we have a lot of elders still in their homes because they don't have any other place to go. And they have, you know, healthcare and safety issues that often I think before the pandemic were not that obvious. And now I think people are much more alert to this. So there are conversations happening in our communities about partnerships between health directors, public safety staff, and our local hospitals. How do we serve people in their homes better than perhaps we have? And then, of course, as I think you're all aware, you know, many communities have done a pretty good job trying to provide assistance to tenants and businesses who otherwise probably would have folded a lot, you know, ages ago if they hadn't had some help. A couple more slides and then I'm done. I'm having fun here. Call for diversity. This has been a fascinating thing to watch over the last year. Well, we've all been kind of worried about whether we were going to get toilet paper and paper towels at the grocery store. There's been a very serious conversation underway in this country about diversity in our communities. And we have to face the fact that on the South Shore, you know, we are not as diverse as we're probably going to be because we are attracting people here from the city who want the home. We are also seeing a real uptick in multifamily housing, and that's going to also enable people perhaps to live here who couldn't live here before. Now, how do we engage them in our communities and include them? This conversation, I think, is happening more in a number of communities. I've worked in towns recently where people are saying we need to have some organized presence inside town government about dealing with diversity and promoting it and supporting it. And it affects a whole lot of things from, you know, how our hiring practices encourage or discourage minority applicants? What's the culture in our workplace? Do we actually support diversity? Are we tolerating things that perhaps, you know, need to be put in check? How do we build leadership to promote equity in our communities in all of its manifestations, not only within town hall, but in all of our neighborhoods? Certainly, you can't talk about diversity and equity without talking about housing policy. And I see the whole kind of Black Lives Matter thing really accelerating the conversation about housing policy because you can't divorce the two. And then public education, we're seeing much more. I've actually been asked to do 5 sessions in April on fair housing in communities, not so much down here, but up around the Boston area. People are recognizing that you can't really talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion without talking about housing. And then what does that mean in terms of just your whole housing framework, your development framework as a community? And then also how to support businesses that are Black owned and people of color owned businesses. How do we encourage them? We have plenty of Black-owned businesses on the South Shore. A lot of people don't even know that they're here. So thinking about how do we promote those? And then my last one is just this thoughts on housing. Is housing still the enemy? I think more towns are getting it about the importance of housing choice. I'm seeing definitely more interest in housing and mixed use development. Those images on this slide are all South Shore communities. 3 of them are Plymouth. 1 is Weymouth Landing. If you guys want to talk about interesting housing opportunities, I can tell you in Plymouth, there may be plenty of single family permits going up, but there's also housing choice happening in this town that really didn't exist here before. And it's not just Plymouth, but I happen to have my office here. Housing is an agent also in resuscitating, troubled mall sites. We've certainly seen that in a couple of communities on the South Shore, where if you want to kind of turn the mall climate around, you have to think about how are you bringing capital in to do this. Housing has become a critical agent in those conversations. That we do, however, have infrastructure challenges that make it difficult in some communities to provide higher density housing. So it's an uneven proposition region-wide, but where the infrastructure exists, it's happening. And we're making great places as a result. I'm done.
Judi, that was great. Thank you. You answered more questions than I would have been able to ask you, except for the most important question of all.
What's that?
Who was the Puritan? Was that one of the Mathers?
No, it was George Whitfield.
Okay.
First Great Awakening.
Okay. Very good. Nancy, you mentioned the challenge with supply side, people ordering bicycles and not getting pedals. I've got a story worse than that. I know a guy who bought a bus company 2 months before the COVID shutdown. Bought the buses and then the wheels couldn't turn. When Sargent, what was going through your mind to buy 3 bus lines just before a COVID shutdown? And, more importantly, is the reopening, because the state economy does not return until Boston reopens, and that's going to be tied to the MBTA and private carriers like you. And everyone's looking for the carriers and the MBTA to predict when can you start opening full service again, and what are you seeing out there?
I was in South Station yesterday, and it's still kind of a ghost town. There are some runs I seem to be coming down from New Hampshire and Maine, but 2 people, 3 people, whatever, get off the bus. So right now we're trying to make the hard decision about when we're going to run next, and that's probably going to be in May sometime. And I guess, for us, we can't afford to run an operation and put people's lives at risk with COVID. That was our first stance. And we would, I think that was the right decision all day long. So it's really going to be we're seeing a lot of uptick to the airports. People are being dropped off at the airports, but they're not taking a bus because they're not feeling comfortable enough about getting on a bus. So we're hopefully that the amounts of vaccine that are going to be out there, that people are going to be more comfortable about getting on a bus. And so the way we look at it is, so historically, just on that Route 3 run alone, we do between 700,000 to 1 million trips a year. 29 trips coming out of Hyannis going back and forth. Before COVID, it was funny. It was all about, we committed to 27 new buses, and and they aren't cheap. They're $500,000 plus a piece. And we signed a wonderful deal John put together. John Cogliano is my president. He's a former Secretary of Transportation, and put together a great deal with TF Green. Came up with a great route and schedule, and we were changing around everything. It was just, everything was going right for us. So our strategy had to change overnight because we changed everything about the business. Technology, you have it, kiosks, up and down routes, going into Logan. So we had to immediately turn over into how do we get into a survival mode. It's not about us, and it's not about, our 161 employees, and because we also do the Logan Express north of Boston. So, it's more about, the million people, the million trips in the South Shore that count on us, because this thing goes back to 1888. So we kind of think we're the best setup to survive this, to come out. And so right now, the hard decision for us is, at what time in May, let's say, are we going to run again? It might trip into June a little bit. It's all about, us feeling real comfortable with the quote herd, immunity, factor of it. And our riders, our ridership will tell us too. We're getting a lot of it. Our riders were set up on text and the email system, and they're starting to ask. Or when I was in South Station, Greyhound said to me, "Geez, everybody keeps asking, when's P&B coming back?" So we're probably best poised that we didn't run. From an economic factor, I think anybody who had been running since last March is probably burning through millions. And that was part of our decision factor, but more importantly, we didn't want to be responsible for spreading the virus. So we think the airport business is going to start first. I believe that I was joking with some bankers yesterday, saying, if you don't think anybody's going to come back into Boston, you've been watching too many of the Planet of the Apes movies. Come on, they're kind of be a history major. It's not going. It's going to be. You can feel the pent up demand of sorts, but more importantly, it's all going to be about, when does somebody feel safe about getting on a bus. So Massport, I think Braintree is the only one that's really operating for them, but that's all airport employees. So when you look at the parking lot there and you see it's pretty full, it's all airport employees really.
That's Logan bus line, not the
correct. Yeah. So we've got a tough decision when to start again, because when we start, there's no turning back. You just can't do that to people. And I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for us. Certainly, trains aren't mobile, and we think the traffic patterns are going to change, and maybe they're coming out of Boston. So we're going to be able to be nimble enough to be able to react to that and serve the communities. Who knows if the trains don't meet the schedules that people want, maybe maybe we help out, or maybe developers who were saying, hey, I was going to have a development and I was counting on public transportation. Well, we can feel, so there's a bunch of issues or situations we think we can feel the need for. As you can imagine, most of our focus has always been north to south. The long term for us is figuring east to west, and maybe the TF Green is part of that. As part of that solution as we figure out. Part of our plan too is the park and rides. I mean, we'd love to have a couple on the Route 3 corridor farther south, so people don't feel like they have to go to Braintree to hop on from there, or they complain that the current parking lots during normal times we're always full and I couldn't get onto it.
So I do think one of the disruptors in all of this has been a much greater awareness, or to Judy's terms, a much greater awakening about lifestyle and balancing quality of life with how we work. And whether that's, and it goes beyond splitting the new work week from being in the office or working remotely. I think it's going to affect transportation, and people are they'll go back to the commute, but they don't want a miserable commute. And I think they're going to be looking for sort of quality of life in the commute. How do they make that commute without being totally uncomfortable, totally unproductive. How does the bus line do that? I know just before the shutdown, you bought a new fleet of buses. But how are you looking at the quality of service, not just the run and the schedule, but the bus riding experience? And if I said that a year ago, everyone would have laughed, saying the bus riding experience, yeah, we know what that is. But I think people are looking for better experiences with how they work, how they travel, how they live after this, and they're willing to give up a little bit for that.
You were on one of our buses. Well, one of the models they gave us in the meantime we were putting to the order. You know, these things aren't buses; they're spaceships. They're beautiful. The technology inside of this. So here's the classic story. So I was kind of tired. I forget when it was. Maybe it was October before the pandemic, and we'd taken over in July. And I'm like, you know what? I should be taking the bus in. I took the bus in. It was great. I wasn't all stressed out. I was, relaxed, etc. I do have to give a lot of credit to our drivers, and they're known. We're in the customer service business. That's what we're really in, and they're really known for their reputation. So if we can provide, I guess in any competitive market, if we can provide the service that people want, they're going to flock to us. There's a little bit of a track record here going back to 1888. We also, before this, we were never interested in the charter business. The charter business is just, I've called 6 other bus companies. What's your price? We're not interested in that. What we're interested in is the workforce transportation. So out in California, Google, all the high-tech companies out of Silicon Valley, they have special buses transporting their people back. So under this fear of the pandemic, I can see some of that. And we've already been talking to a lot of companies in Kendall Square about, hey, geez, parking there is impossible, and running routes for companies going back and forth. So and we think we're going to be nimble. We've said, okay, what happens if a lot of companies do move to the South Shore? Well, probably their employees might be somewhere, in the metropolitan Boston area. So we can handle that traffic coming out down to the South Shore. So, and we think traffic patterns are going to change, and we think we can be more nimble towards meeting that. So yeah, it was horrible. They figure 65% of the coach companies in this country are going to toss in the keys, and a lot of them already have. So we made the right strategic moves. Everything looks to be positive.
This is a great discussion, and you've all left me with a lot of questions. I could pepper you with questions for the next couple of hours, but let me, before I get into some questions I have out of this, Courtney, can I turn it over to you? Do we have some questions from the participants?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I can take it from here, Peter, for a minute. So if you have a question for the panel, I ask that you use the Q&A function on your menu bar, or use the raise hand function on your menu too, and I'm happy to call on you live, and you can ask the question yourselves. But we do have one question so far, so I'll kick it off with this one. Krista Manna from KR Architecture and Interiors asks, do you see a continued demand for smaller office spaces as things move past the pandemic, or do you see a move toward larger offices? What kind of amenities do you see being added by building owners to entice people to come back to the office? I guess that's probably a question for Carol and Nancy would be my guess.
You want me to jump in?
Yeah, that'd be great.
You know, I have been thinking a lot about that, obviously, because that's the place we're in right now. You know, people, I think one of the panelists mentioned the optimism around vaccines. You know, it's just, you can sort of feel it in the air when you're in a Zoom meeting, that people that are getting their vaccines, there's a little bit more future thought in their minds, that this is starting to move behind us, or at least beside us. So we're starting to think about, you know, are we looking at hybrid models, you know, bringing half the team in and then the team coming out during other times. Now, for us in real estate, we were very fortunate, and we're very grateful for this. We were always deemed an essential business, so we were never shut down. But to Wynn's point, we always had to be so careful about how we were doing things. So on the sales side, we've continued to be open. Our offices are all large enough that we can provide enough space for 1 to 2 to maybe 5 is tops that we'll allow at this point. The state has allowed more. We've taken a little bit more of this a conservative route, because the way we look at this is so much can be done remotely by phone, one-on-one with clients. So that's the sales side of things. So I don't see ourselves decreasing any space, because I want to have our realtors have enough space to spread out when they do decide to come in to meet with a client. And they can be in open space, not in a closed environment in a conference room, if they have to have a meeting with a client or a builder. So that's one side of it. As far as our headquarters, our staff, that's where we're looking at some hybrid models. And so for me, we're building this new building, and I'm putting a lot of thought into now is how do people want to work? You know, as Peter said, there's an enormous thought process around lifestyle and having balance. And, you know, we need to respond to that as businesses. I think it's really important. Probably, you know, many of us have been doing that all along, but I think even more so now. So when I look at our new building, you know, we're incorporating space where there's a little cafe where a member of staff can get a break, can get a cup of coffee. You know, our architects, you know, Krista's calling from an architectural company. They Rockland Architects in Pembroke recommended we have a wellness room, like a quiet room where if someone's got a headache or they just need some quiet time for a minute, then go in and just get some dark. We didn't have that before. You know, if you've got a mom that's got a baby at home and she needs to have some private space, we have that space in the new building. So in a way, COVID for us at Conway has provided us an opportunity to rethink how we do things. What do our clients need from us, A, and B, what do our realtors need from us? You know, what type of support do they need? And then C, what does our staff need for us? And how does that all work for their life balance? You know, being able to be there for their families, for themselves. We had a presentation yesterday. It was all via Zoom. We get together with our top agents twice a year in person. Generally, it's a networking event. We generally have a speaker, et cetera. Yesterday, we had it on Zoom, and we invited a speaker. And I mentioned to the speaker in preparing for the event that these realtors are under enormous pressure. Now, we're very grateful. This isn't a complaint. We're very grateful that our businesses, you know, it's just so hard to see some of the things that people have gone through. On the other hand, the stress of dealing with this incredible buyer demand where people are losing out on houses one after another, and they're disappointed, they're angry, they're upset. And then you have sellers that are, you know, there's incredible prices out there that are being, you know, expected at this point. So there's stress like any job. So we talked to this speaker focused on the balance between your spiritual, your physical, and your mental. And, you know, our company has always been sort of about that, but even more so now, because as much as all of our businesses, we're all going through a lot just as business people, but then you have this underlining thing, this thing that is so uncertain. You know, we hear different news reports, you know, can we carry the virus now that we're vaccinated? None of us know this. So it's like uncertainty and fear. So there's a lot being balanced, and we have to, as business owners, be conscious of the fact that we've got to care for our employees, and in our case, of many salespeople as well. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's what we're experiencing.
Great, thanks, Carol. Nancy, do you want to add anything?
I don't know that there's been a direction yet when it comes to the need for office and, the drive to either get smaller or larger. I do think a lot of companies are making do with what they have, but maybe cutting back on employees in the space. And like I said before, I think that they're changing a little bit when it came to the whole bullpen concept and everybody share a common desk and all of that. I think there's a little bit more pulling back to having more offices to be able to close a door. And obviously the need for technology to be able to Zoom or connect at any time has definitely accelerated versus in person all the time. We are seeing, not in office, but in apartments. I'm involved in an apartment construction right now where the amenities are really being ramped up. So people that might be getting out of a home or now wanted to rent an apartment, I'm seeing these apartments, the structure of them are looking like high-end condos. And like Carol mentioned, everyone's getting a puppy. An apartment building I toured just 2 weeks ago, they are expecting more dogs than they are children. So they had to come up with a way to make sure that the owners of the animals weren't leaving the debris outside. And so what a common management experience is you get a puppy, they're going to swab the cheek, or any animal, swab the cheek and get the DNA, so that if the dog has left their deposit on the lawn outside, you will be fined. So they're going to find you. So I think that those are the clever little, amenities, because I do believe that is an amenity for someone living in an apartment building. And I think that all of those type of bobbing and weaving thought process is what's going to help office, apartment, life get back to normal, but with a little bit more appreciation for each other and what we might want.
Great, thanks, Nancy. We have a few more questions now in the Q&A box. I'm going to do my best to get through as many of them as we can. I'm going to ask this one question from the chat, and then I'll probably just focus on the Q&A portion. But Judi, this question is for you. Do you have a sense of which towns in the South Shore footprint will request housing choice designation, other than ones already approved? Yeah. Whew.
That for me?
Yeah, that's for you, Judi.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, because I've just been trying to follow the chat because I'm fascinated by it. My comment was, Plymouth is an obvious contender because there's so much housing construction happening here, and it's, a lot of it is single family on larger lots, but there's also multifamily development here. So Plymouth is obvious. It's probably one of the top housing producers, frankly, in the state. I would not be surprised to see Quincy and possibly Canton and maybe even Hanover hitting kind of eligibility for housing choice designation. There's been a lot of multifamily development in Quincy, and they've done a nice job. Certainly in Canton as well. So some of those communities come to mind, and I may be forgetting somebody, but I just also wanted to point out that we have to be careful when we're looking at just raw building statistics, building permit statistics, and saying, oh, well, there's a lot of building happening in X community, because in some of our towns, a lot of the building permits that are being issued are actually just replacing teardowns. So we have to you have to really look at what's happening in that market. But some of these places are actually net new housing.
Great, thanks, Judi. I'm going to bounce around a little bit in the questions, so bear with me here. But Nancy Bronner says, my company, Sterling Corporation, provides moving and related services to numerous life sciences companies, as well as office users. Does the South of Boston area have the infrastructure to accommodate these companies, as well as expedited zoning? Is the business community talking with schools about developing training for the needed workforce? I don't know who that goes to, but anyone want to take a stab?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, Nancy, we'll get back to you. Let's see here. I have another question. transportation question. So probably to win. How do you change the status quo on commuting RE bus transportation, smart corridor, streetscape? With the utilization of buses, you can move exponentially more people through Route 3/93 to Boston while reducing traffic by taking cars off the road. 60 people in one bus versus one person per car. How do you get people to recognize that value? Win, what's your secret?
So we were, first of all, it's the schedule. People are looking for a repetitive schedule, reliability, and safety. And we started to implement that from the beginning. I think one of the things that we're going to do that's different versus the prior owners, we're going to do a lot more advertising and promotion. So one of the things that it really kind of fits in with our model, we signed a deal with the U.S. Army for drivers. The industry in general is having we seem to be, and I think it's because of John, we don't seem to have problems, getting people because of his reputation. He's brought in a lot of people, because we were underwater probably like 10 to 15 drivers the minute we took over. But this deal with the U.S. Army just fits exactly what we want to do. Service, a process, customer service, driven the whole thing. I mean, what's the old phrase? Money goes where it's treated best. And the same thing. We do have a reputation with our drivers. They're, the commuters that go with us, it's a cult. They think they own the company, and we love that. So we want to take care of them. Clearly, whether it's a year from now, 2 years from now, we'll be going back to the same thing with congestion. And we think we have a lot of answers to solve some of the congestions, whether it's our changing of the route, changing of the traffic patterns, our idea of the park and rides. I mean, it's an interesting model because it's capital intensive, but strategically, it can be very fun. And I guess my final remark is, the public is going to tell us what they want, and I don't see, and there's no reason why I can't see where we're not able to provide what they want.
All right, thanks, Wynn. Thank you.
Courtney, can we jump back to that question from Sterling Corporation?
Yeah, sure.
This has just been rattling around in my head.
Yeah, real quickly, I have 3 more questions after that, and then we'll probably wrap up and transition over to the networking session. So, Judi, if you want to take a stab at the Sterling Corporation's question, and then I'll follow on with these last 3 questions, and then we'll close up for today.
So, on the issue of the expedited zoning, zoning for expedited permitting, we do have some communities that have adopted so-called Chapter 43D to accelerate the permitting process for non-residential, or for that matter, mixed-use development. How well they've accomplished that actual acceleration, I think, remains to be seen. But I do know we have communities, because of the Green Communities program, that have adopted zoning specifically to accelerate manufacturing for renewables. So, it's going to vary by code, but some communities are very conscious of wanting to develop their tax base, and they'll accelerate the permitting process for manufacturing. And others are very picky about, well, what kind of manufacturing are we talking about? But as for the issue about the schools, it hit me as I was sitting here drawing a blank. The schools that are having the conversations with employers are the community colleges. There's a bigger conversation taking place in the education world right now about why we expect kids at the age of 13 or 14 to choose whether they're going to a voc-tech school or an academic school. And do we need to kind of reunify this, which is, of course, the way it used to be 40 years ago. So that conversation is kind of going on in some communities, but I would say the real lifeblood of workforce development is the community colleges, which we have a few of on the South Shore. I think those are the places where that conversation is really taking place, more than the public schools, with some exceptions.
Great, thanks, Judi. Another question for you, Judi. How do you see communities responding to the governor's housing choice bill, and do you think it will result in an increase in affordable housing and or mixed use development?
Well, I hope so. It's my world, right?
Right.
You know, the funny thing is that the housing choice bill's broad blanket about what it means to be an MBTA community has awakened a lot of people that, oh, they don't just mean like, do you actually have the train station in your town? It's, are you getting service? And, you know, so that's been a bit of talk about the Great Awakening. I think that's really part of it. I think some communities, the officials in some communities want to be able to go to town meeting and get something passed with less than a 2/3 vote. I can tell you, I see that. You know, we've all heard stories about accessory dwelling unit bylaws dying by 2 votes or something. So there is some frustration with that. I do think that you'll see some communities wanting to take advantage of that, especially ones that have a progressive view toward housing and are actually doing something about diversity and equity. I think when you see all that conversation taking place, you're going to see communities that want to use the simple majority path to get something permitted. I think other communities are concerned about it. But again, you know, my advice to anybody looking to develop or build or settle on the South Shore is we have progressive towns and we have some that aren't. And it's no different than any other region in the state. So there are definitely places that are having a conversation now about what does it mean to be able to get something done for housing in our community and put some teeth into it when we say, yes, we want to support diversity, equity, and inclusion. And oh, by the way, how about supporting our own local economy? And on that note, I would say the chamber deserves a lot of credit because I've definitely heard an increased awareness of housing is an economic development issue. Oh my God. You know, that's a new conversation and it still isn't happening in some parts of the Commonwealth, but it's definitely happening here.
Thank you, Judi. Okay, 2 more questions. It looks like this one from Patrick Powers is probably for Carol or Nancy or both maybe. Do you see these buyers creating a future problem regarding equity in their new purchase if the prices don't catch up with the increased purchase price? Is it potential for a future bubble popping?
You want to take that one first, Nancy?
Well, I wouldn't see it as much from a residential side, just because I'm a commercial lender. But you know, we're always concerned at the time of the economy when so many lenders will do no money down or interest only loans, and I think that's when there's a forecast. That's a problem because you know, can the people really afford that debt that they're taking on? And, you know, we are seeing situations when we're looking at properties that investors are looking to purchase. Well, let's say it's a multifamily home where the purchase price is really up here, but the income only supports debt down here. So there is a disconnect in some of those. And that's when, you know, giving, you know, financing, you have to use your head sometimes and not just, it's not an X percentage of whatever they're going to willing to pay because how are they going to pay for the mortgage? So there does have to be a correction. The prices cannot just continue to escalate beyond what the market is going to support when it comes to the income.
Yeah, Nancy, I agree. And, you know, there's a couple of things going on here and I don't necessarily think this is a bubble. But I do agree with Nancy that at some point there will be a leveling off or correction, if you will. So the last time we went through the Great Recession, as Nancy said so perfectly, is that the underpinnings of the mortgage industry, the qualifying of buyers and sellers at that time was truly flawed. And you literally, and I think most of us were all in the business at the time, and many of you on the call, I mean, there were people buying homes that literally could not afford them because of the advent of the stated income, stated asset. You know, they used to call them the liar loans. And now I'm not saying that everybody was lying on their mortgage applications, but there was this not as much of a need to verify information. And I was in the mortgage business at the time. And, you know, it was kind of a scary time to be in the mortgage business because you can feel this, you know, we're putting mortgages together And you know that there's a security on the other side. There's a mortgage-backed security. The investor is buying these. They're being rated by triple, agencies. And it was just a complete perfect storm, and the whole thing sort of fell apart. And we all, we've been climbing out of it for a lot of years. So I really have to commend the banks and the mortgage companies for being, and I think the CFPB has helped this, for staying true to having a foundation of financial standards. The qualifying ratios today are similar to the qualifying ratios of 20, 30, 40 years ago. We've got FHA and VA have not changed their ratios too much, over the years, except again, during that time period, everybody got a little bit more loose on that. So I think that's what was the big differentiator at that time. Now, when you see prices increase to this, at this rate, you do ask that question, and you say, first of all, are appraisers going to be able to appraise these properties? And I think that's the big question. We have a lot of checks and balances in the real estate industry and the banking industry, which I think are really important. And one of our checks and balances is that we have appraisers, that their responsibility, of course, is to appraise that property. But, the market value of a property is basically defined as what a buyer would pay in a certain market. That's a definition. Now, an appraiser has to go one step further or several steps further and come up with actual comparable houses that have sold in a certain period of time. Now, they have plenty of those right now because there's a lot of properties being sold. So we are starting to see homes not coming out at appraised value, and sometimes significantly below, maybe slightly below. But you're going to start seeing that. You're going to start seeing the checks and balances start to kick in. And that's when the mortgage company will say, well, we got to reduce that price in order to make it happen. So I like to see that. That's part of when I talked about the stress. That's part of the stress that the buyers are going through it. But that's an okay stress. Like that's the type of thing that's in place to protect ourselves from ourselves. And I think that's important. And so, I think we're going to see more of that. To Nancy's point, I think we've got a much stronger economy going into this. GDP is stronger. Unemployment is less. Rates are lower. So there's a lot of good things that are happening in our economy. So I don't necessarily see a bubble, but I do think I'm looking forward to the day that there's going to be more of a balance between supply and demand, because this feels a little bit too chaotic to me, and unreasonable. It can't stay this way. So I'll leave you with this one thought on that topic. And that is, I had this vision, and, I think a lot about buyer behavior, buyer and seller behavior. And first of all, Judi, thank you so much for all that information. That was fabulous, because we didn't talk about the, construction and development in the communities, and all of this has to work for all of this to work successfully for everybody. So that was great information. Thank you. But the other piece of it, we talk about baby boomers, Judi and I both talked about that. We're both members of the baby boomer generation. We're only just starting to get vaccinated. So that means, so let's think, Judi, let's say, for instance, 6 months ago, you wanted to sell your house. You might say, you know what? I'm not sure that I want a whole bunch of strangers coming into my home right now, right?
Right. Yep.
So there's a lot of people like that, I envision, are going to start putting their prices in the market. So the reason why I bring that up with that particular question is when the supply starts coming up, the demand will start decreasing. We all know that, right? And that will help those prices correct themselves and sort of settle down. So I'm looking forward to that. No realtor, you may think this is true, but no realtor wants to continue seeing the prices increase the way they're increasing, because it feels a little unrealistic. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Carol. Thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. I'm happy to facilitate some answers after the session, but I'm going to turn it back over to Peter to do a quick wrap up, and then we will flip over to the networking portion of the session. So thank you all for attending. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Courtney. And I'm encouraged from what I hear. It's been a tough year, but I've been pretty bullish about what the next 5 years could mean for the suburbs and particularly the South Shore with some of the work we've been doing and anticipating, particularly around housing the last few years. And all of you have had a part in that some way. Carol with helping design our South Shore 2030 plan, Rockland Trust being a primary funder of the housing initiative. Nancy is co-chair of our housing committee. Judi sits on that committee, and Wynn is vice chair of our economic development doing this. So you've all participated, but I think we're in for a very exciting period of certainly some change, still some uncertainty, but the South Shore, I think, is in for one of its best periods ever over the next decade or two. And I think we're going to start seeing those pieces fall in place more over the next few years. Carol, Wynn, Nancy, Judi, thank you very much for doing this. And again, thanks
thank you.
Real Estate.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you
for letting us partner with them again on this. So Rick, back to you, or Courtney, back to you. I'm not sure which.
Yep, I'll take it. And then Rick, I'll go ahead and toss it over to you. I'm going to launch a slide for you all to take a couple of minutes while we do transition into the networking session. Please feel free to follow us on social. Here's a few of our channels. So this will take a few minutes, so please bear with us as we transition everyone over. Rick, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Peter. Excellent job. The panel, all I can say about the panel is, wow. That was great information. Unbelievable. I was just like, I couldn't stop listening. It could have gone on for another hour. So I appreciate the information that you put out. Thank you very much for that. While we're